So, hi everyone, I'm back again to talk about Dragon's Breath. This is probably the weapon, the single weapon that has been the most requested weapon that I talk about this season, given that this YouTube channel kind of started on the basis of talking about damage, a lot of DPS related stuff. People are asking me, hey, is Dragon's Breath good in solo? Is it good in fireteam? Should I use Dragon's Breath instead of, galley with regular rockets? Like, how's it looking? So here I am to tell you about Dragon's Breath. This video is going to be split up into 7 sections, with the first section being kind of a disclaimer and talking about how I tested this rocket because it's very annoying. Okay, so let's start with that. First of all, Dragon's Breath is very annoying to test. Okay, if you decide to test this rocket yourself, you will probably run into the same problems that I did. Okay, Dragon's Breath, first of all, is very inconsistent in its behavior. Will you get 3 ignites? Will you get 4 ignites? Will you get 2 ignites? Will you get 3 ignites and some scorch? Will a Harpy randomly travel underneath Templar and blow up next to him, and then you have to restart the test? So, kind of annoying, right? That's number 1. Number 2, right? In terms of testing this weapon, Dragon's Breath has a lot of interactions with shooting it multiple times, shooting it with max stacks versus 3 stacks versus 1 stack, shooting it with other people in your fire team who are also shooting it. So there's a lot of stuff. It scales very differently depending on how you shoot it, how you use it. And so a lot of the conclusions that I arrive at this video, you'll see me kind of talking about them tentatively. And especially when I'm talking about using it in a team environment, I'm not super certain exactly on the exact numbers when it comes to how good this weapon is. So in the future, right, people in speedruns, people in low mans, whatever people choose to do going forward, I'm sure they will use this weapon. I'm just trying to provide some base knowledge based on the testing methodology that I know, that I'm pretty good at, and I'm going to try to use that to provide some knowledge base so that other people can take this information going forward and kind of test their own Dragon's Breath rotations and see if it's worth using in more, large size fire teams, etc., etc. So with that being said, let's get this out of the way and talk about the base stats of Dragon's Breath. Now, Dragon's Breath is a very, very strong weapon at base, okay? If we go ahead and look at the single tab, you'll notice that Dragon's Breath is actually very, very high up on the list, and that it's right over here, okay? So the total damage of Dragon's Breath is 3.8 million damage, right? Now, this is assuming, right? This is assuming that you have every single shot and you space it out one by one, okay? So you shoot one 5x shot and you wait for that scorching and igniting to happen. You let it happen, and then you do another one, and then you do another one, and then you do another one, and every single shot gets quad ignites, right? Every single shot gets 4 ignites. You do max damage, but you space them all out one by one, right? Now, that being said, 3.85 million damage for a single weapon is very, very high, okay? For reference, a slide shot surrounded Crux Termination 4, 3 million total damage, right? Something like Whisper of the Worm, where is it? It's somewhere down here. We gotta find it. Whisper of the Worm, there you go. Whisper of the Worm, 3.6 million damage, right? And obviously a lot lower DPS. So for this thing to have even a simulated total damage of 3.85 million damage, that's very good. Okay, so this thing is very, very good total damage. Let's get that out of the way. Now, in terms of base DPS, there are 2 DPS values that you see here, and I'll explain what they mean in a second. So the first DPS value is 292,000. Now, that seems very high. It is very high, okay? But this DPS 1 value is basically short-term shot-to-shot DPS. And what this assumes is that, let's say you shoot 2 shots back-to-back using Radiant Dance Machines, right? And basically the damage from shot 1 to shot 2, during that window of time, how high is your DPS? And so we know that Dragon's Breath can be shot very quickly. It can be shot every 1.316 seconds, assuming you're using Radiant Dance Machines to reload dodge it. So basically, between those 2 shots, you're going to be doing 292,000 DPS. So this thing has pretty decent burst DPS, okay? Now, the second value is overall across its entire damage window, right? Across shooting all of its shots, and assuming you also account for this scaling down of its DPS, how much damage does it do? Of course, it's substantially lower, but I rank this tab of the spreadsheet using sustained overall DPS. So this is still pretty high, right? This is still pretty good. So this is already looking pretty good for Dragon's Breath. Now, am I saying that you should use Dragon's Breath over something like Leviathan's Breath, or over something like Acreus, or over something like even like Winterbite with like Synthos? Not necessarily. And so there is a reason why, and we're going to go over that in just a second. So we're going to go over to this nice tab in my spreadsheet over here. This is like a temporary clipboard testing tab that I've made, mostly specifically for Dragon's Breath because it's very annoying. And we'll talk about this. So you're probably looking at this and being like, Aegis, what are all these numbers? What are all these numbers? These are all numbers. I don't understand what these numbers mean. What do they mean? So basically what I did is I got some friends and I asked them to help me test Dragon's Breath. And in different fire team sizes, we shot one Dragon's Breath at the Templar boss, and I checked and recorded how much damage it did to the boss each time. And so if I shot once, if I just shot him once with one person, we're going to assume that's a multiplier of 1. Okay, so that is how much damage one person does. We're going to set that as the base value. Okay, when you shoot with 2 people, it does 1.5 times, right? So one person is losing half their damage. If you shoot with 3 people, it's 2 times. So again, about 50% extra. 3 people for some reason was 62% extra. 4 people on top was like 40% extra, then 30%. So as you can see, every single time you add someone else in your fire team using Dragon's Breath, you decrease the efficiency or the efficacy of this rocket, right? And the reason for that is obvious, right? A boss can only ignite so many times per second, and eventually you are going to eat somebody else's ignition damage, and they're probably going to eat your ignition damage at some point. So this weapon does decrease its efficacy in larger size fire teams. However, right, when I was testing this weapon, it does seem to take into account other people's ignitions, sort of in accelerating the reload of your own weapon. So their scorch stack speeding up your ignitions does speed up how quickly you can reload. So it's not necessarily a horrible thing to have 2 people with Dragon's Breath in the fire team, especially given that the base value of this weapon is very high. Okay, so there's something I missed when talking about base stats, and we'll get back to scaling in a second here because there's a couple other stuff I want to talk about, but something I didn't talk about in base stats is, let's actually go to the single shot damage of Dragon's Breath, right? The single shot damage of Dragon's Breath is about 180,000, right? Assuming that you have a quad ignite and nobody is doing damage with you, you have 180,000 damage per shot. Now, that's a lot. That's a lot, right? Fully buffed, that's like 385k, right? And if we go up the list here and we go to something like Apex Predator, notice that Apex Predator ends up being like 311k, right? So this weapon does more damage, and by the way, this is with Pack Hunter. This weapon does more damage per shot than Apex Predator, assuming somebody else is shooting galley next to you, so you have Wolfpack rounds, and you have Enhanced around it, right? That's very high. That's very, very high per shot damage, and the only penalty to using this weapon is obviously multiple people lowers the efficiency of the weapon, and number 2, there's another thing which we'll talk about when we get the usage, okay? So just off the rip, this weapon does very, very high per shot damage. It's very inconsistent, like I said. Getting quad ignite is not very common. And again, when we get to usage, we'll talk about how to maybe, improve your chances. But again, just at a base level, even if you divide this number by 2, this is already very competitive compared to other exotic heavy weapons, okay? Now, especially in solo instances, like we said, where other people are not interfering. But let's move back to the testing page. So in fire teams, we already talked about scaling 1 to 6. Now, I also tested solo. We can kind of ignore these numbers because this is basically a superior version of the previous thing. So I also tested solo, and I was wondering, if I'm shooting Dragon's Breath, right? And I guess, okay, this test is kind of important as well, but we'll talk about this, okay? So how did I test Dragon's Breath for solo? So obviously, a lot of people were criticizing other YouTubers and saying like, hey, you're testing Dragon's Breath wrong. You're not supposed to be spam reloading it. You're not supposed to be like spamming it with Radiant Dance Machines, for example. Like how are you supposed to use this weapon correctly? Well, the way Dragon's Breath works is that every single time you ignite a target, you get 2 stacks of fuel in composite propellant, okay? So composite propellant, right, you always have 1 stack, and when you hit 5 stacks by igniting things, you get an auto reload for free. So basically your goal is to go from 1 stack to 3 stack to 5 stack, and you do that by causing 2 ignitions. So your goal is basically shoot the gun, get 2 ignitions as quickly as possible, and then shoot the gun again. A lot of YouTubers, when they were first testing this, made the mistake of shooting the gun and then continuously shooting the gun before you got 5x. And if you don't get 5x, you don't get the maximum scorch, you don't get the maximum ignition rate from this weapon. So what I did is basically, I did what a lot of people were saying was like a good way to do damage with this gun, and that is I used Apotheosis Veil with Incinerator Snap and Touch of Flame Fusion grenades, and I basically spammed the snap and grenade over and over to get a bunch of reloads, and I only shot the weapon once it hit 5x, okay? So to get an idea of kind of what that looks like, I'm going to take a random clip that I took earlier today. Let's take, I don't know, let's take this one just for an example, right? So what I did here, let me skip over a little bit here. Boom, I would shoot it, snap, grenade, I wait for the reload, snap, I reload, boom, shoots. but I'm never manually reloading the rocket, right? I'm letting the rocket just reload itself, right? And the nice thing about this is that I know from, thankfully, from previous experience making the spreadsheet, how much damage one incinerator snap does. I know how much damage one fusion grenade does. And every single fusion grenade and snap I subtracted from the total damage done to the health bar. And then the remaining damage, we can assume that's Dragon's Breath damage. And we take that, we divide it by 1.25, which is the well buff, right? 1.25, that's radiant. And then we have remaining the number of, the amount of damage that all of the combined Dragon's Breath shots do. So what I did was I did that for 4 different tests because this gun is extremely inconsistent, like I mentioned, right? Getting quad ignites is very rare. And of course, when you're shooting a bunch of them by snapping and nading, whatever, the timing is going to be always off a little bit. So I did my best. I did 4 different tests and I got the wipe screen numbers. I got the health bar numbers, and all in all, right? After all of that, the average per shot value of Dragon's Breath is around 143,000, right? That's really good. That's really good. Because like I said earlier, that 180k number, that 179k number that I mentioned is very high, right? But I did say you need a quad ignite, and this is solo, and you're just shooting one rocket, and you're just letting the boss sit there and continuously ignite. The fact that you don't even lose that much damage, you're still at 143k, and you're basically spamming using the weapon like quote unquote correctly, that's really good, right? Because if we go to the single tab here, and we change this number to 143k, you'll notice 306k, right? It's 306k per shot, including buff, debuff, whatever. And you go to Apex, and that's almost the same thing. So basically what I'm trying to tell you here is that as long as you're solo, as long as you're by yourself, Dragon's Breath, if you use it correctly and you shoot it at 5x and you're shooting at the bottom of the boss, ideally, right? Which we'll talk about in a second. As long as you're shooting that correctly, you are going to be doing per shot the same damage as if you had enhanced surrounded on an Apex Predator and you had a galley user in your fire team, right? So this is really, really good. Absolutely, there's not a question. This is the best solo exotic power weapon in the game, right? It's not even close. There's no question. It's better than everything else out there. It's basically like an auto-loading hothead, except the hothead has the hothead has built-in pack hunter. It has enhanced surrounded, and it also just spits out scorch everywhere, right? It just ignites the target repeatedly. So really, really great. Now the problem is, one of the reasons why Dragon's Breath is inconsistent is because of its scorch projectiles, right? So if you didn't know, Dragon's Breath basically embeds a target with a projectile, right? It embeds like a little rocket, like a lasting impression kind of rocket, into a target, and then it repeatedly spouts scorch projectiles out of the target. And if those projectiles hit the target, they leave like a flaming trail that eventually ignites the boss or whatever it hits. Now, the problem with this is that if you shoot a boss in the face, it will repeatedly spout those projectiles, but not at the boss. It will spout them elsewhere, like on the floor or like up, right? And you don't want that. So ideally what you do is you embed the rocket inside the bottom of a boss. So a lot of people are saying this is like anarchy. You should stick it underneath the floor of the boss so it ticks the boss. This is not necessarily true because number one, this rocket still does direct impact damage. It's not a huge amount, but it is there, right? And I noticed that on average, when I was shooting a boss like the bottom part of Templar, rather than shooting the floor, I was doing more damage on average. So that is a myth. Don't actually shoot the floor. If you can shoot a boss's leg, or you can shoot like the underside of a boss, that is the ideal way to use this weapon because you're getting direct impact damage, but you're also getting those kind of spouting scorch projectiles that actually hit the boss, okay? So that's pretty important. I wasn't even using a boss that's ideal. Templar's hitbox is not very big, and it doesn't, really have, it has like a pointy underside, which is like pretty small for those scorch projectiles to hit, right? So kind of a pain in the ass to test. But most bosses in the game, especially bosses like Riven, where you can kind of like shoot under her jaw and have all of those projectiles hit, really, really great, right? So make sure when you're using this weapon, I would say the fundamental concepts to have in mind are, number one, make sure you shoot the rocket in a place where the scorch projectiles will hit the boss. They will spout up, or they'll spout into the boss instead of away from the boss and on the floor, right? Where they'll ignite ads instead of the boss, right? That's number one. Number two is that a lot of people have this misconception, which I guess is section 4, have this misconception that you have to work as hard as possible to cause ignitions to get this rocket to be good, right? In my experience, just having 2 people shoot a boss with Dragon's Breath at the same time with Ember of Ashes on or whatever was doing enough scorch the boss to ignite it to the point where you were reloading the gun at max fire rate, which is like, not max fire rate, I should say the max ignition reload rate, right? There is a limit to the amount of ignitions you can cause on a boss at a specific time, right? And so if you are wasting your time snapping the boss, throwing nades at the boss, trying to ignite it as much as possible, you are actually lowering your damage. So in my opinion, the best way to use this weapon, which we'll talk about when we get to compatibility and class rotations, but the best way to use this weapon is don't focus on creating as many ignitions as possible. The gun already does that by itself for the most part, right? You can do a little bit of that, but don't devote your whole build and all of your time doing damage to just snapping the boss and throwing fusion grenades at the boss, because that is going to decrease your overall output. The best way to use this weapon is to use it like an auto-loading rocket that just happens to do a shit ton of damage, okay? So you want to use it as an auto-loading rocket, and then while the rocket is igniting the boss and, you know, going crazy, doing lots of good background damage, you're using, you know, kinetic special weapons, energy special weapons to supplement that damage. Or if you're on Hunter, you can use like Warden's Law, which I'll talk about in a second as well. So I think that's a big misconception. I've seen a lot of people try doing damage with this weapon, and they put on like Apotheos's Veil and they throw like fusion grenades and snap the boss repeatedly. And, you know, that looks good and it feels like you're doing a lot of damage, but in reality, snapping doesn't do very much damage, and neither do fusion grenades, right? You want to be trying to create those ignitions either passively by having another person use Dragon's Breath, maybe use Sunbracers or Verities or something like that instead, and then dump your other weapons while it's doing damage in the background, right? So it's kind of like an anarchy in that way. Some people have kind of suggested that, except for it's even better because it's a rocket and it's auto-loading, right? Which anarchy isn't. So yeah, that's basically how you should use this weapon, in my opinion, at least from the findings that I have right now. Also, for those of you who are curious about how this weapon scales if you do spam it, right, rather than just allowing it to kind of cook and ignite and get those 5x stacks, if you do choose to spam this weapon, it punishes you a lot, right? There's a reason people were, I think, mad against like Astacross or something. So listen, if you are one person and you shoot Dragon's Breath by using Rain of Fire, for example, Rain of Fire allows you to shoot this thing very quickly. If you shoot 2 shots back to back, boom, your second shot, 60% of the damage is gone from your second shot. That's a lot, right? If you do 3, boom, 96% of your, not 96, I would say, if you shoot 3 rockets, 3 Dragon's Breath rockets back to back to back, it is the same as shooting 2 rockets spaced out, right? That's how bad it is when you're spamming this rocket. So try not to spam this rocket. You're cutting into the total damage, you're not using the rocket correctly, and you may as well just use another exotic heavy. You want to use this basically like an auto-loading rocket and position it correctly so that you do get those ignites in time, okay? Now a tip. We're going to talk about rotations pretty soon, but a tip for you, for those of you who are trying to design rotation around this thing, from my measurements, if you don't have Ember of Ashes on, reloads very slowly. It's like, I think it's like 6 or 7 seconds because the second ignite takes forever. If you do have Ember of Ashes on and you shoot this rocket in the right spot, it'll reload in around 5 seconds. And if you have very, very fast ignitions, like you have a team that is igniting this target very, very quickly, or you are igniting the target very, very quickly, I think you can get the reload down to around 3.5 seconds. That was the lowest I saw it go. So if you want to be safe, I would say stick to around 5 seconds and figure out what you're going to do with the other 2 slots in your, inventory while this gun is, loading, basically. That is the job of a rotation, right? Rotations have always been about, hey, I have one weapon that is doing a lot of damage, and in the meantime, while that weapon is auto-loading, I should figure out how to kill time during that auto-loading time, in this case 5 seconds, with my other 2 weapons or abilities, okay? So, for example, one thing you could do is you could shoot the rocket and then pop your super, do some super damage, and by the time you come out of your super, maybe throw a grenade or something, boom, your rocket is loaded. Maybe you could shoot the rocket and then switch to some shotguns, do some lightweight shotgun swapping, switch back. Maybe you could shoot the rocket, do a Warden's Law mag, reload it, switch back, rocket's probably loaded, right? So there's a lot of stuff you can do here, and this is where the swap tab comes in handy, okay? The swap tab will tell you all of these different options that are in the kinetic and energy slot that you can swap to, and you can see which ones do the most damage, and you can figure out which one is best for you. So, for example, slug shotgun swapping, or using Wilderflight, or a rapid fire shotgun. There's a lot of different options here. So, yeah, that's all I'm going to say there. Let's talk about compatibility. So, compatibility, I'm specifically talking about exotic armor. So, a lot of people were suggesting that I test, for example, Dawn Course with this thing. People were saying, hey, test Ember of Ashes, test Ember of Eruption, test this, test that. So, I wanted to kind of go over some of these things and talk about what they do, okay? So, first of all, Dawn Chorus, which was like, I think the most requested exotic armor that I test with Dragon's Breath, in my experience, doesn't do anything. Doesn't do anything. Dragon's Breath was very inconsistent, but on average, I did not see Dawn Chorus do anything significant to this weapon whatsoever. So, I can't really vouch for Dawn Chorus. Also, the melee regen of Dawn Chorus, even with high strength, as someone was suggesting, is not very good. Yeah, it's not very good damage. It doesn't like buff the damage that much. Or sorry, not... What am I saying? It doesn't regen your snap fast enough to be usable, okay? So Dawn Chorus is kind of out. Apotheos's Veil, I mean, it's cool and all, but I don't know. In my opinion, the best exotic to probably use with this is probably Sunbracers, I think, right? So what you would do is you probably just, you know, snap an ad, and then right as damage starts, because a lot of people don't know this, you know, Sunbracers, the timer of throwing your grenades doesn't start until you actually start throwing your grenades. So, you know, you snap an ad before damage, you spam some solar grenades at the boss right as damage starts, and then you start cooking with your Dragon's Breath. Because think about it, solar grenades, you know, they last a very long time, they do some very good damage, and they'll ignite for about as long as Apotheosis will, assuming Apotheosis is using fusion grenades. Maybe Apotheosis with solar grenades isn't that bad either, but again, I really want to get people away from wasting their time on snapping the boss and trying to ignite the boss more, when again, the weapon already does that at base, as long as you're helping it just a little bit, right? And by helping it a little bit, I mean maybe having another person use Dragon's Breath, or just throwing like 1 or 2 nades. You don't have to waste your time trying to snap and go for instant ignites. This weapon will still load very quickly, and you are wasting your time by doing that, okay? So that being said, you know, you can use Apotheosis if you want. I mean, it's not the end of the world. I think Sunbracers has a shot. I think Verities has a shot in team settings. But I would say, yeah, Dawn Chorus is probably not worth using. I would say Rain of Fire is actually the best overall weapon I would use with this thing, because not only can you reload Dragon's Breath in a pinch if you need to, but you also have 2 other weapons which are much more flexible if you have Rain of Fire, because you can use something like a GL, you can double shot it, you can use something like a sniper or a shotgun that doesn't have a loader perk, so it opens up your options a lot more, and Dragon's Breath doesn't necessitate that you use a specific armor exotic to boost damage, so Rain of Fire is obviously a really good neutral option in that regard. Now, for the other 2 classes that are not Warlock, I would say Lucky Pants is a phenomenal pick for a Dragon's Breath rotation, mostly because number 1, we're talking about an exotic power weapon here, so Warden's Law being an option is obviously extremely very potent, especially if you're solo and you don't have anybody else to kind of shoot galley for you, for example. So that's really strong. And obviously Warden's Law takes a very long time. It takes like 5-6 seconds to dump the entire mag plus reload, so that's perfect for using Dragon's Breath. You just need to find an energy weapon that shoots for long enough that you can offset your Lucky Pants timer, as well as offset your Dragon's Breath reload timer. My suggestions are something like Royal Executioner, or maybe something like Ikelos SR. Those weapons have slow enough firing times, or you know, big enough reserves with like something like 4 times a charm to be compatible with a rotation like this. You can use like you know, throwing knives as well to supplement your rotation, but I haven't really experimented much with that. Again, that's something I'm going to leave to you. But again, I will caution you that using abilities like grenades and melees, unless they are buffed correctly or go off without a hitch very quickly, they do not really increase your damage rotation's potency by much, unless you're using them to, you know, debuff with like Revitalizing Blast from this season, for example, in a solo instance. So finally, we have Titan. I mean, on Titan, I guess if you want to stick with like the solar kind of mantra, you could use Pyrogale, I suppose. But on Titan, realistically, this season, you're probably doing strand damage anyway. If you need to do range damage for some reason, I mean, I guess you could use, again, you probably wouldn't use Pyrogale for range damage, but I don't know. I guess you could use Pyrogale and then just do, I don't know, maybe Coil Fusions or something, like the classic. But yeah, I think that's pretty much it. Yeah, I think that's all I have to say for Dragon's Breath. This is a very complicated weapon. In terms of usage, I expect it to be very dominant in solo challenges. It has very good total damage. You're definitely not going to be dumping this entire thing's reserves, no matter how hard you try in like a dungeon 1 phase or something like that, or in not a dungeon 1 phase, I should say, in 1 dungeon boss's phase, even if you're solo. Unless you are spamming it, which is, again, not the correct way to use this. This thing has great total damage. It has just okay utility. I don't expect this thing to be used in like GMs, but it has great total damage. You can kind of stick a boss and just, you know, focus on doing other stuff, pop your super. Yeah, it's pretty good. Very annoying weapon to test, though, I will say, overall. And yeah, I wish you guys the best of luck with testing this weapon for yourself. I'm sorry that I don't have any like really conclusive numbers for fireteam scenarios. I mean, I've given you kind of the scaling that gives you an idea of not probably wanting to use 6 of these, but I could be wrong. I haven't actually taken 6 people, 6, you know, competent damage dealers, and told them to do a specific damage rotation on a boss with Dragon's Breath and then compared it to Izzy GL Apex or something like that, but I would assume that it is worse. I will probably test this in the future, but you know, we'll see about that. So with that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed this video on Dragon's Breath. Bit of a number crunch for some of the sections, but I hope you learned something new. I hope we cleared up some misconceptions. If you want just the basics, make sure you shoot the feet or you shoot the underside of a boss. If you want to use this, try not to shoot the ground unless the boss is a very unfavorable hitbox for hitting them directly. That's number 1. Number 2, this thing's very good in solo. Number 3, you know, fire team scaling is kind of questionable. Don't spam this thing. Number 4, try not to focus too hard on getting ignitions. This thing will get ignitions passively as long as you are on ashes and you are shooting the boss in the correct location. So you want to focus on filling that downtime while the weapon is auto-loading in order to make best use of this thing for damage. And yeah, that's pretty much it. This thing is a very competitive weapon, but it's also a very uncertain one in terms of raw damage quantities. So yeah, I will see you guys later, and yeah, I hope you enjoyed.